lecture, so give me a few minutes.
Live on YouTube now. Live on YouTube now to start the
Okay, we are live on YouTube. So I'm going to close this for. Okay. So today we are looking at how should we study Africa? Can you see the presentation well before I go ahead?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So the content of this particular lecture I've taken from Taiwo Olufemi, um, where it talks about what is African studies, African scholars, Africanist scholars, and the production of knowledge. And this is found in a book by Helen Law and Kofi Anyidoho, which is titled Reclaiming the Human Sciences and Humanities Through African Perspectives. It's volume 2. And I've shared the reading with you. I will share it again if you haven't received it. Please read it at your own time as well in details. Things we should know about the study of Africa. So when we're talking about African studies, I just wanted to introduce us in this module um, through a conversation that is saying, what is it that we are studying when we're saying we are studying Africa? African studies may mean different things. There are many of us that are doing African scholarship, what we call African studies. So African studies may mean, amongst other things, things about Africa that are studied by anyone. So anyone who studies things about Africa, who desires to know such things for whatever reason, can be said to be studying, to be doing African studies. So that's one perspective that Taiwo talks about. The second perspective of African studies may mean studies of anything that are undertaken by Africans, wherever Africans may be. For instance, not all of us as Africans stay in Africa. Some of us stay in Europe, some of us stay in Asia, some of us stay in Latin America. We are everywhere, but we are doing studies on Africa. So anybody that is studying anything that is undertaken by Africans, wherever Africans may be. So it could also be that it is not necessarily people of African origin, but it's anyone that is studying anything about us as Africans. It is also said to be African studies, or it may mean African studies. That is why you are able to find in the US centers of African studies. You go to Europe, you find European African centers of studies. You go to various universities that are outside of the African continent in various contexts. You still find centers of African studies in the Scandinavians, for instance. because it is people that are studying anything that is undertaken by Africans, wherever Africans are. And Taiwo then brings us the third perspective to say African studies also may mean studies of any subject matter. Any subject matter. Could be geography, could be history, could be economics, it could be sexuality, it could be gender, it could be health, any study, any subject matter that is studied from an African point of view. So if you're doing geography and you're looking at geography in the phases of the moon and the stars from the perspective of Africa, you could be said to be studying Africa or doing African studies. So there are various thoughts, schools of thoughts about what actually is African studies. Number four, Taiwo says that African studies may also mean studies of African issues that are undertaken by Africans. African issues that are undertaken by Africans who seek solutions to African problems within African institutions of learning. In other words, this perspective says African studies can only be studies that are undertaken by African people themselves who are looking for African solutions to problems that are facing the world. Solutions to problems that are facing Africa or African people within African institutions of learning. So this perspective suggests that African studies can only be those that are undertaken in Africa, within African institutions, by African people looking for African solutions. So it's that kind of a perspective. So there are varied perspectives. There's not a singular story. It's important to note that. So some of us, as you are developing as a scholar, as a politician, as an African scholar, you will find yourself in all these perspectives, whether you argue for a perspective that says African studies can only be undertaken by Africans only within African institutions who seek and provide African solutions to the problems that are faced by Africans. It is your perspective. You could also be locating yourself within a paradigm that says Africa is not just studied by African people, but it is studies of any subject matter that is studied from an African point of view. So anyone doesn't have to be an African person. Anyone who studies any subject matter using an African point of view can argue to be doing African studies. You could also locate yourself within that paradigm. Similarly, others would argue that African studies are studies that can only be undertaken by Africans who study anything that they would like to study. Anything, geography, life, the moon, the stars, uh, politics, economy, and so on. As long as it is done by African people, wherever African people are, then that is African studies. It's again your opinion and your location as an African scholar. And we started by saying others argue that African studies include things about Africa that are studied by anyone. Doesn't have to be a person of African descent. It has to just be things about Africa, whether it is a way of life, whether it's about African food, African economies, African lifestyles, African geographies, and so on. Anybody that is doing that kind of study who desires to know and to study such things for whatever reason can be said to be doing African studies. So there are many other perspectives. They are not just these four, but this is what Taiwo covers in the reading that we are referencing today. So these are the things that we need to know when we study Africa, that African studies are not a singular story. There are multiple perspectives about what actually comprises African studies. So some of the problems and challenges that I would like to outline around what we should know about the study of Africa is the fact that things about Africa that are studied by anyone who desires to study such things for whatever reason is that non-Africans producing knowledge about Africa that is not intended for Africans but intended for others to use remains a problem and a challenge. So for instance, if you are locating yourself within paradigm number one that says African studies is about things regarding Africa, and anyone who studies that, who desires to know about Africa, can be said to be doing African studies. Some scholars argue that the problem with that is that anyone who's non-African, and this is what has been happening with colonization and slavery and apartheid and so on, that there's a lot of non-Africans who have written our stories as African people, with using various perspectives, of course, because they desire to know our cultures, our way of life, how we eat, how we sing, how we dance, how we drum, how we make love, and so on and so on. So the problem is that then you find non-Africans who are producing knowledge about Africa that is not really intended for Africans. It is the knowledge that they produce about our lifestyles and our way of being that is intended for their desires. Desires could include wanting to perhaps give donations, you know, or get scholarships, or for political reasons, or for exploitation, to perhaps know about the amount of raw material, gold and diamonds and so on that Africa has, like it has been the case. It could be for purposes like the Chinese are doing of capitalist gain, of identifying spots for economic development, for political settlement in the case of colonization and so on. So a number of um, people who have produced knowledge using this first paradigm, or this perspective of saying we are doing African studies even though we are non-Africans, because we have a desire to know more about Africa. The intentions have always been to produce that knowledge not for Africans but for themselves. That is the argument that Taiwo is bringing. So that is one of the problematic elements of that and the challenges of that perspective. Secondly, the challenge of the second perspective also, which is the critical analysis of the studies of anything that are undertaken by Africans, wherever Africans may be. So if we argue that, for example, African studies can only be undertaken by Africans who study anything that would like to study, wherever Africans may be, the argument there is that there is a challenge about that kind of pointing to African studies, because in various contexts outside of Africa, what this does, it causes a rift, it causes a kind of conflict between those who call themselves Africanists and those who call themselves African scholars. Because once you are saying, I am African studies can only be African studies because it must be studied by someone who's African, you will then first have to answer the question that says, who is actually African? And it's a big debate. There are people who call themselves Africanists, but are not of African origin. Africanists because, and these are like your anthropologists, Europeans, Asians, Latin Americans who study Africa for whatever reasons. And because they've produced information on Africa, they are then Africanists. And because they subscribe in their hearts and in their minds to philosophies of Ubuntu, Butu, African Renaissance, and so on, then they claim the identity of being Africanists. And there are those who call themselves African scholars, who, of course, scholars of African origin, people who are born in Africa, in the valleys and hills of the African continent. Um, and then it causes that rift to say, if African scholarship or African studies are only by Africans, in this particular context, African scholars and not Africanists, then what does it make of Africanists, people who've produced this knowledge? So when you travel the world, then you get that kind of intellectual conflict that arise, that argues to say, actually, what is African studies? Can we say that the amount of knowledge that was produced, for example, by European anthropologists is African scholarship or not? So that is the challenge of paradigm number two. And number three, which argues that studies of any subject matter that is studied from an African point of view. So anyone, for example, who studies anything, as long as it is done using a theory of African Renaissance, for argument's sake, or the philosophy of Ubuntu, argues that that is African studies. The challenge that is identified scholarly about that particular perspective is that there is no single view of an African perspective. What is an African perspective? So for one to argue that scholarship is African mainly because we have adopted African Renaissance theories or African philosophies of Ubuntu and so on, you would then first have to argue a point to say this is actually an African perspective. And it starts from even arguing about who is an African. So I would like to point you also to some of the readings that Chimamanda Adichie, when she spoke about the dangers of a single story. It's a beautiful story that she shares of her life and her brother when she went to study in the United States for the first time, and she narrates it beautifully. I will share this story with you. When she arrived at a university residence in New York, and she was sleeping with this roommate who was asking her, because she was an African girl coming from a rural, I think, rural Nigeria. And what she was expecting of Chimamanda is for her not to know the song. I think one of the songs they were talking about, which is the song of Beyonce. Anyway, it's a long story, but she was expecting Chimamanda to probably be talking about cows and cattle and so on, you know, how the whole understanding of who Africa is and how we are made of, that she should not be able to know anything that is seen as modern. Um, and the story is long, but anyway, so Chimamanda then is one example that shows, actually deepens the question that says, what is an African perspective? Because a lot of people have written about Africa. A lot of people are looking at Africa with the bird's eye view from outside, and of course have produced narratives, have produced perspectives and ideas. Are these ideas actually African perspectives or not? So that is the challenge about the third perspective. And the fourth perspective challenge is that when you are saying that studies of African issues are undertaken by Africans who want solutions for African problems within African institutions, basically saying that anything that can claim to be African must be born in Africa, must be of African origin, undertaken by an African within an African institution, studies African issues. Some then argue to say you cannot make that claim because there are no African problems. The world is so vast. We are talking of human problems that affect the world, including Africa. So you cannot isolate Africa and say African problems, because any problems, whether it's problems of climate, problems of water, hunger, starvation, poverty, economic challenges, everyone in the world goes through that as humanity. Why would one want to come and argue that we've got something called African problems? So scholars show all these varied perspectives, but of course you would need to then argue your own paradigm within these issues. But there are questions, there are key questions that remain. Who should design the content of African studies based on these paradigms that Taiwo presents to us? as we start this module about understanding African politics and development. Who should design the content of what we call African studies? Is it people who are born in Africa? Is it anyone that is interested in African issues? Who should shape the narrative of African studies? Who is Africa? These are the questions. Um, so I would like to pause there, to pause there, and perhaps take us into groups for the next 5 to 10 minutes to discuss this question, these questions that I've shared with you now. Who should design the content of Africa, in your view? Who should shape this narrative, and who is Africa? So I'll give you for about 5 to 10 minutes to go for discussions, and then we'll come back and have the conversation. So I'm going to put you into groups now. You will go randomly into groups. I will come into all the groups and check in. So please join the group that you see in your screen. Noluntu Naledi Fanele, please join the group.
Guys, why are you so quiet?
Hello. I see there are people who are back here in plenary. Are you having any problems joining the groups? Lungisi, Zota, Fantasia. Are you guys okay?
Not really, ma'am. I'm just so wondering, what are we supposed to do? Can you repeat that again,
No
please?
problem. So what we are doing is we are discussing these three questions.
Okay.
Who should design the content of African studies? Um, just your view, from where you are sitting. And who should shape the narrative of what we call African studies? Actually, who is Africa? So that's what we are discussing, just your thoughts. And we will come back into the main plenary after discussion to share the conversation together as a class.
So we should discuss it as a group.
As a group, yes. That is why I've
Oh,
assigned you to the different groups so that each and every group can discuss and then we'll all come back together and have one discussion as a class.
Okay.
Discussing in the different groups. So you need to then decide how you have your discussion in your different groups once you are done, and then I will close the room in the next 10 minutes or so. We'll come back and we have one discussion.
Thank you.
Any other question? Uh, any other question? Sophia, are you okay? Please talk to me. I see your mics are muted. I need to know if you're fine because you should be in groups and not here.
Ma'am, will these slides be on Moodle?
They will be, yes.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Right. So I'm gonna allocate you back to groups.
Yes, ma'am, please.
Okay. Hi, I can see you trying to join, but your sound is not connected. So I know you can hear me, but I cannot hear you. And I just see I see you as iPhone, so I'm not sure if you can let me know what is your name, and I can allocate it to the group. Everyone is in groups now. There's a group discussion going on, so I can allocate you in the group. If you can just type in the chat, let me know who you are. iPhone. Nakho konke ni right la egroupini yenu? I'm just checking in. Sinakho konke. I see Hisense. Someone has joined with the number 081. Mlungisi, ni right la egroupini yenu? I can't hear you. You are muted. Konke kuhamba kahle? Hello? Konke, can you hear me?
Hello, doctor.
Hello. I'm just checking if ni right in your group. If everyone is okay, you're supposed to be in a discussion.
I don't know where to go from here.
Your sound is very, very far. Hello? Hello? Can somebody talk to me, please? I can't hear you. I don't know where to go from here. Okay, hi Sense, do you want to say to me what do you mean by that? What do you mean you don't know where to go from here? Is everyone clear what you expected to be doing? If you can't speak, you can type in the chat room. That's also fine. Then I can know what's happening because I can't hear your voices. So other groups have requested more time, the extension of time. That is why group work has been extended until 10 past 10. So I will close the groups exactly at 10 past 10. So continue with your discussions, and then we'll come back to plenary at 10 past 10. All right, welcome back. I see most of us are back from the breakaway rooms. How was the discussion?
Oh, the discussion was very good. I think we have managed to engage in a manner that is very professional and to be free. Some people can't even express themselves in a what can I say, in a position whereby there are a lot of people. So with us being in a number of 4 5, I think we have managed to express our views freely. Thank you.
Very nice. I'm happy about that.
Nice.
Okay, let's hear then what your thoughts are. You can share from your groups. Anyone from any group that would like to go, just to reflect on the three questions. What are your thoughts? Feel free to show your video as well if you want to.
Hi, Doc. Um,
Hello.
well, I don't know if I remember the first question correctly, but I think it went along the lines of saying, Uguti, who then is meant to, I think, share experiences about Africa. Am I right?
Yeah, I'm projecting the questions up here again. Yeah,
Oh,
there they are.
should design the content of African studies. Basically, from my perspective, I feel like it's mainly people that are indigenous of Africa because you can't speak of you can speak of experience that you don't know of, but you get more in context of what's happening and what is around if it's a person from that place. Like I made an example in the group. I was like, if I lose my mom and you tell me that I know what you're going through, automatically I'm going to be like, you can't say you know what I'm going through because you've never lost your mom. I don't know if I'm making sense. So I'm saying it's people from Africa that need to design that context of African. Yeah.
So essentially, you're aligning yourself with the perspective that says only people from Africa can develop the narrative and the content about African studies and no one else.
Yes, to a certain extent, though, I'm aligning myself with that perspective.
Okay. Thank you for sharing, Fanele. Very interesting. Anyone else? Any other thoughts? Remember, your perspective is your perspective. There are no right or wrong answers. When we study, when we learn like this, part of it is for you to be able to develop your own positionality, develop your own voice, and find your political voice. So don't feel like your perspective is wrong. There are no wrong right answers at all. So feel free to differ and come up from a different angle as well. So which group were you, Fanele? Was it group one or group two or group three?
I was in group 3.
Group three. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Anyone from group three that would like to reflect, add, or a different perspective, if any?
Hi, Doctor. I just agree with what Panetta said, and we basically discussed the same thing, so I have the same views with him.
Asti, okay, thank you so much. So all of you are sort of Africans, can only be Africans, and whatever is African studies can only be from Africans. Okay, thank you so much. Let's hear from other groups. Maybe I should ask this. Are there any questions that you have for group three based on their positionality? Anyone wants to ask them a question?
Oh, thank you. I would like to pose a question to the group since they are saying that only indigenous African only shape the African content. So Actually, what constitutes someone to be called an indigenous African? What criteria does someone can be accredited as this one is a native African and is an indigenous African? Thank you.
Very good question. Thank you so much. Any other questions for the group? So the question that is being asked, how do you actually determine that someone is African? If you say to a greater extent, the narrative has got to be shaped by Africans.
Can I please answer? See if I could answer it.
Yes, Panela.
That's a very good question for Musenamile. Indigenous, you're right. It's like saying you actually can't. There's no criteria of being African because even if I'm South African, but anyone born in Africa is African. So yeah, my perspective it ends halfway. You can't really factor it to long term or anywhere. That's why this is actually very hard because there's no criteria for being African. But my perspective, like it just goes halfway. So it can't even, I don't know. Yeah, there's no criteria. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Hello, guys.
Hi, Siki.
Well, I think Usena Milo who asked the previous question. I think what really makes an indigenous African, really for me, is not only someone who is born in Africa and who's African and whatnot, but I think the experiences that people born in this continent have, and their culture, their traditions. I feel like those are the things that can that add to someone who the indigenous part of being an African. I feel like it doesn't matter how much, for example, if maybe you're from Europe or you're English or whatever, and you've come to Africa for a certain amount of years to come study maybe the culture and the people of this continent. I feel like you would never really have the purest or whatever perspective and of the indigenous people of this place, because you don't really share the same experiences and the same upbringing maybe, or really understand the culture and the traditions and the whys, and like why certain things are a certain way, why certain people do things a certain way. I think it not only depends, I mean, it's not only being indigenous is not only based on the color of your skin or where you were born, but it's the experiences and the culture and they are bringing that one experiences that adds to who they are, I guess, or the culture. Thanks.
Oh, sorry, doctor, to just intrude,
No
but
problem. Feel free.
I'm triggered by what the two fellows are saying, that it doesn't matter if you have only experiences of Africa, then you can be an African. So are we saying that in our tent, people are saying that, which means it depends with the minimum years, or there's some years that you have to live in Africa for you to be accredited as an African? Because I thought that they will say, when we speak of native Africans, we speak of people maybe who were born in Africa, or we speak of people who share their roots from the African, not people who came to Africa as slaves or who came to Africa as settlers. So I would like to get it from that grip. How do we differentiate from those who came to Africa as slaves and settlers who are now claiming to be Africa, and those whom they found in Africa, in the African soil? So I'd like to get it from that point of view. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senamile. I mean, those are critical questions. I mean, I think at this point, I realize now it's actually 20 past. We should be wrapping up class. There's other people maybe having another class to go to. But I want to bring in, I don't know, I mean, many of us may have seen this, and I am going to put it on Moodle. this video yaga former President Thabo Mbeki that says I'm an African. So it's few minutes, about a minute or two. So I'm gonna play that, and I'm gonna play Chimamanda Adichie, The Dangers of a Single Story, and perhaps we can wrap up for now, and we'll continue the conversation on Wednesday. But let us listen to these two.
I am an African. I owe my being to the hills and the valleys, the mountains and the glades, the rivers, the deserts, the trees, the flowers, the seas, and the ever-changing seasons that define the face of our native land. My body has frozen in our frost and in our latter-day snows. It has thawed in the warmth of our sunshine and melted in the heat of the midday sun. The crack and the rumble of the summer thunder, lashed by startling lightning, have been a cause both of trembling and of hope. The fragrances of nature have been as pleasant to us as the sight of the white blooms of the citizens of the veld. The dramatic shapes of the dragon's back, the soil-colored waters of the Likwa, Iqili, Lotuga, and the sands of the Kalaman have all been panels of the set on the natural stage on which we act out the foolish deeds of the theater of the day. At times, and in fear, I have wondered whether I should concede equal citizenship of our country to the leopard and the lion, the elephant and the springbok, the hyena, the black mamba, and the pestilential mosquito. A human presence among all of these, a feature on the face of our native land just defined, I know that none dare challenge me when I say I am an African. I am the grandchild of the warrior men and women that incense Kukuni land. Patriots that set Ryan and people took to battle. The soldiers who Shweshwe and Gumunyane taught never to dishonor the cause of freedom. I am the child of Nonghaus. I am he who made it possible to trade in the world markets in diamonds and gold and the same food for which our stomachs yearn. Being part of all of these people, and in the knowledge that none dares contest that assertion, I shall claim that I'm an African.
Yeah, our former president there claims, right? Claims a couple of things based on the subject matter that we are having. That I'm a child of Nongawuse. I claim my being from the valleys and the hills and so on. Of course, that shapes a particular narrative and a particular perspective. Some of the questions that you're asking, Senamile. I'm going to bring in Chimamanda Adichie, and then we can sort of wound up because of time and continue on Wednesday. It's also not a long video, it's very short, 1-2 minutes, and then we'll come back to the conversation.
Was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, living domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university. university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Murid Baduti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story.
Okay, so that is Amamanda. I don't want to keep you longer. It is 28 minutes past. I know some of us are going to another class, but if you have any reflections, I know the groups have not all reflected, but just some closing remarks around this question for today. We will go deeper in these questions on Wednesday. So those are some of the issues that are being raised. Tabombeki particularly raises a particular perspective about who is an African in terms of the questions that you're asking, and what other contributions have been. And Chimamanda takes us even deeper to questions of saying, actually, what is the narrative of who is African in that story? There's always a single story told in a particular way by certain people. Is that what is actually African? So I'll leave you to just reflect maybe for another minute, and we'll wrap up at 10:30 if anyone wants to come in. Otherwise, we can hold it here and think about it, sit with it, and come back on Wednesday and continue. The floor is open.
Oh, thank you. I think we have to go and start, then we'll come back on Wednesday prepared.
Sure, that would be
Yes.
great. Please prepare, read. I will send you this reading. Read it as well and read your own material if you want to. Let us come on Wednesday and have a deeper discussion about these 3 questions. I'll circulate the
Okay,
notes
Doc.
on, yeah, I'll circulate the questions on Moodle as well, and I will put our WhatsApp group in place. I'll send the link on email. Please join and see you on Wednesday. So Namile, you wanted to say something, or is it finally? I had someone's
It's
voice.
me, Doc. I just wanted to ask for the Wednesday. Is the links? Is that code still the same? The joining code?
No, there are different codes. I'm going to post it here now. For each and every class, you'll see in the course outline. Please make sure that you double check every time. The numbers are different for each class.
Oh, okay. Thank
But
you.
what will happen is that every Monday it will be the same code, every Wednesday it will be the same code, every Friday it will be the same code that is put on each day.
Okay, no problem. Thank you, Doc.
You're welcome. I just want to register here also the fact that I am aware that there's only about 22 of us who were able to join class today. Again, it's issues of data. And this is why for Post 204, I was struggling to really continue with model classes.
Yeah, I remember.
And I mean, with these Zoom classes, because a lot of students get excluded. Yeah, I don't know what it is, but I will find out what the reasons are, and we'll find different modalities. I think we'll continue with Zoom, but perhaps record them like we do and share with others via WhatsApp for those who can't.
I think it worked better with 204 because we also used WhatsApp.
Yeah. Okay, so I will set up a WhatsApp group then after this, so that we can catch up with those who are not able to join us on Zoom. I'm also aware that a number of people have dropped out because of connection and signal from when we started, especially when we went to group discussions. But thank you so much for turning up. Sincere apologies for all the inconveniences. I know everyone is angry because of faulty marks and so on. We are sorting that out. I will speak to the dean today and the academic leader to follow up on that. Please do not panic. It's a situation that is resolvable. I just don't know where the delays are, but it is a systemic issue that I can assure you it will be resolved.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
You too.
Okay, bye.